All right, our next subject area will be your social studies. And we're continuing our look at Jamestown. Remember, we talked about Princess Pocahontas and how unfortunately she passed away as she was finally trying to get back home. She had not seen her family for many years, and she had a young son that she wanted to introduce to his heritage, his grandfather, Chief Powhatan. But she got sick aboard the ship going back to Jamestown, and her husband had to turn the ship around so she could go back to England, and that's where she's buried. And if you look at a video about her, you'll see exactly. I'm not sure where she is buried, but I know there's a statue of her standing where she's got her burial site. She tried to help the relationship between the Indians and the settlers, the white settlers. Remember, many of these men were not good Christians, and they did not treat the Indians properly. We do have some that were and tried to bring the word of God to Powhatan and his people. Well, anyway, Jamestown continued to grow, and I want you to look at the picture here, and we see something different. We know that when the settlers first came on the three ships, they were basically rich men, and they were adventurers, and they were even young boys who were there for the sake of adventure. But now look at this picture. This looks kind of homey. We're on page 142, the settlement grows. Okay, we look at the picture and we see it's a very homey scene or setting. We have a father, and he looks like he's trying to fix his axe. You see the axe head on the floor. There's a little girl sitting on the floor, and she looks like she's darning socks. She's mending them or fixing them, sewing them. And then you have the mom with the baby, and you have a kettle on the stove and two kettles going, and it looks very, very cozy and homey. What has happened to Jamestown? Well, let me give you some information. It says, in 1608, just 1 year later, small groups of women began coming to Jamestown. As more women lived in Jamestown, the men became responsible for the women and children. The men who were once irresponsible and quarrelsome became family men, husbands and fathers. This was necessary to make the settlement the kind of place that could face hardship, pull together, and last. This is a good example of what God says in Genesis 2:18. And that is, it is not good that the man should be alone. So when the women came, that's when the family started. The men married the women, and they settled down. And when you have the responsibility of taking care of your home and your wife and your children, you don't tend to be reckless, and you tend to want to work harder because you have to feed the family and you want to make money. Remember, whatever they made or did in Jamestown, they would sell to the ships coming back and forth from England. They would need money to buy supplies that the ships brought in, and they would need to have some goods to sell to them. For example, the furs, maybe they did find some gems, maybe some of the produce that they grew, like the squash and the corn. Remember, corn was not introduced to Europe until this part of the world was discovered, because it was something that the Indians all the way from what is now the United States into South America, corn was a very, very important crop to grow. Okay, so what we have here is a very interesting family setting. Okay, now We have servants. What do we mean by servants? Well, let me read this to you and then we'll read the 2 pages together. These were called indentured servants. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Jamestown with about 20 Africans, Black Americans. Now, they were not slaves. They were what they would call indentured servants. They were men who wanted to come to America but had no way to pay their passage. And they agreed to serve the men who paid for their tickets, and after several years of service, the servant would be free. And he was even given 50 acres of land to work himself. So that was a pretty good deal. He worked for 7 years to pay off the cost of the passage. He had room and board. Hopefully his master or his the one who paid for that ticket was kind to him and treated him well. And then after the 7 years, he was given his own land, 50 acres, which is a lot of land, so that he could start a farm and maybe raise a family. Okay, now, this practice changed, okay? This practice changed because after a certain number of years, the Africans who came to our country were slaves. They had no freedom. They could never buy their freedom. They were the property of the men who bought them. So that was the beginning of the practice of slavery. At first it was legal, and it was a good thing for these men from Africa, but then afterwards it became a matter of slavery. Okay, let's find out what happened again. In order for the settlement to survive, you have to have laws, right? You just can't have everybody running wild, stealing, taking things from people, destroying people's homes, whatever. So the Jamestown settlers were given the freedom to make their own government. In 1619, they formed what was called the House of Burgesses. It's like a Congress where people got together and made the laws. And it was composed of men who were elected by the other members of the community. This was the first democratic assembly where people had a right to make the laws and to have a say in how they are to be governed. Okay, now we have another reason why this colony, or these colonies, were able to survive. The English wanted to make sure that this colony did not fall apart and disintegrate and become overrun by maybe the Indians, or maybe overrun because people didn't want to work and they just wanted to be lazy and didn't think about growing food or having families to set up a community. Okay, now, they had an enemy called Spain. The English and the Spanish were very, very competitive. They wanted to compete. They wanted to be the masters of their world. And it was who was going to find more land in the New World, who was going to have the most ships, and they were constantly fighting. So the English did not want the Spanish to have more wealth and power in this new world. So they tried to, that's why most of the settlements in what is now the United States was basically English. Maybe as you went further out west, you may have had more Spanish, especially those areas of land that were close to Mexico. Of course, they weren't part of the United States then. That was all open country. Okay, another concern was religion. The Spanish king and the Spanish explorers were Catholic, and they wanted to spread the Catholic religion to the natives. And the English were Protestants. They had broken away from the Catholic Church way back with Henry VIII. And they wanted to make their Christianity part of the New World, and also to make sure that the Native Americans became either Protestant or Catholic. And there was many battles deciding which is which. Now, men like John Rolfe wanted to convert and bring to the knowledge and true worship of Jesus Christ. He wanted the Indians to know that they bear the image of our heavenly Creator, and we and they come from one and the same mold. Okay? So that's why there was all this competition between the English and the Spanish. The French, as I said, went up north to Canada, what is now Canada, and it was the competition between the Spanish and the English, even in the Caribbean, because some of those islands in the Caribbean were started by the English. Okay, let's read this. I'm giving you a really thorough background about Jamestown settlement, and this basically is a review, a very short review. The Jamestown settlers and woodland people had peace after Pocahontas and John Rolfe were married. The settlement changed as women came to live in Jamestown. Families were started and children were born. Families working together made the settlement a better place to live. Servants came to Jamestown with no money. After working 7 years, they became free men. Remember, they had to pay off the person who paid for their passage. More people came to Virginia. They made laws themselves. They formed a new government. Jamestown was the first lasting English settlement. Okay, so we know that the two kinds of people that came were the women and the servant. Now there is an activity on page 183. That looks kind of good. I know some people, when we talked about Indians, made popcorn. That was you, Mariah. You made the popcorn and you didn't give me any. Okay, now in Jamestown today, let's look at the word activity on the next page. In Jamestown today, people are digging up the ground where Jamestown was settled. These people are finding things the men from Jamestown left behind. Remember, those are called artifacts that help us know what the people were like, the tools that they used, how they dressed, what they ate. They found coins that looked like copper pennies, blue glass beads that were traded with the woodland people, and a special ring that belonged to William Strachey, and he lived in Jamestown in 1609. So that was that's a little bit of information. And now the activity is explain that your students, we're going to dig for our own artifacts. Okay, so let's see what you have to do. It says that you should have a container of puffed rice cereal with one candy ring, candy coins, and enough candy jewels. And you are to get a little plastic shovel, and you are going to dig. And you have that picture on page, well, I don't know, do you have, maybe you don't have that picture. Maybe I should show it to you. But what it is digging for artifacts. Now this is puffed rice cereal, pretending to be dirt, and then all kinds of little candy objects, and go digging for the artifacts.